The training ground was too silent for a normal exercise. The cold wind cut through her skin like invisible blades, and each breath came out in white clouds that seemed to carry secrets. She adjusted her posture under the general's steady gaze as he approached slowly, as if measuring not just her body position, but her entire soul. His touch was brief, almost technical, but there was nothing mechanical about it. It was as if in that light touch there was something not taught in military manuals, a silent code as old as war and as dangerous as forbidden love. He said it was simply posture correction. She felt it was a calling. His footsteps receded, but not the weight he had left on her. Every muscle, trained to obey orders, now burned with questions she dared not ask. The looks on the faces of some of her colleagues betrayed that she was not the only one who had noticed something. There was an invisible whisper between them, as if that moment were a breach in a regime where nothing escapes without being recorded. But no one commented. No one took any chances. She knew that in the army, certain touches could mean nothing more than discipline, or they could change entire destinies. And when the sound of a sudden alarm echoed through the barracks, she realized that this would not be the last contact. Just the first sign of something that could cost much more than her uniform. If this touch also made your heart race, you need to stay until the end of the next stories. Like now, subscribe to the channel and comment. I felt the touch. I want to see who is ready to go further. The winter that year seemed harsher than any other recorded at the military base. Snow accumulated in thick layers on rooftops and vehicles, muffling sounds and making each step a small effort against the cold. The icy air invaded the lungs, as if to prove there was no room for weakness. It was a place where discipline and silence were the two official languages. The soldiers moved in a coordinated manner, but there was something about that morning that stood out from the routine. Among them was a woman whose posture drew attention, not because of her impeccable uniform, but because of the way her eyes took in every detail of the surroundings, as if calculating more than simple distances for the next exercise. She knew that in the army, wrong looks could be more dangerous than mishandled ammunition. The general, a man with an unshakable presence and a deep voice that seemed to echo even in the silence, walked ahead of the group, inspecting each row. His record was impeccable, marked by classified missions no one dared question. It was said he could read a soldier's entirety simply by the way he breathed before firing. When he approached her, there was no rush in his movements. His eyes never wavered, and the world seemed to shrink around him. He paused, assessing his posture for a few seconds that felt like minutes, and then stepped forward. His hand lightly touched her shoulder, adjusting the angle like a master craftsman correcting the position of a work in progress. It was quick, but not impersonal. The touch was etched on her like an invisible mark, something no military insignia could erase. Her heart raced, but not from the cold. She could recognize when a gesture carried more than its stated function. He said in a firm, almost neutral tone, "This way, soldier." But there was something in the intonation that didn't belong to hierarchy, but rather to a silent language they both somehow seemed to understand. As he walked away, he didn't look back, but he left behind a tension that wouldn't easily dissipate. She adjusted her breathing and resumed her position, but every fiber of her body now carried a question that couldn't be asked. The exercise began, and the orders sounded like gusts cutting through the air. But her mind wasn't fully on target. It was at the exact moment that the signal sounded. The field, the weapons, the cold, everything seemed distant in the wake of the sensation that something had been triggered at that moment, something that wasn't part of any protocol. And as the snow fell, obscuring any traces on the ground, she realized there were marks that weren't erased by time but by decisions, and the one she would have to make sooner or later could cost more than any battle she had ever faced. The dry blast of a whistle cut through the frigid air, announcing the start of a new training circuit. Boots sank into the snow, and each soldier ran as if carrying not only the weight of their uniform, but also something invisible and non-negotiable, the expectation of not failing. She moved forward with firm steps, controlling her breathing to maintain focus, but inside she felt a restlessness she couldn't explain. It wasn't fear. It was a kind of warning, as if her own body was trying to warn her that she was facing something that could change the trajectory of everything she knew. The general paced the wings, observing, measuring each soldier's performance, but it was impossible not to feel it when his gaze rested on her. It wasn't a look of approval or censure. It was something that, if put into words, would become dangerous. While the other soldiers kept their heads down, focused on the perfect execution of their movements, she caught every tiny shift of his steps, every pause, every command. And then came the moment when the ranks had to reposition. The order was clear. Align, adjust your right shoulder, keep your chin up. But when he approached to check her position, the distance between them seemed to shrink the entire world. He stopped beside her, and again his hand touched her shoulder, this time with a slight glide that might go unnoticed by anyone not so aware of every detail. "Stay steady, soldier," he said, but his tone sounded like advice for something much bigger than a military exercise. She felt a shiver that didn't come from the cold. That seemingly simple gesture carried a weight that clashed with the rigid surroundings. It was as if he were testing not only her physical posture, but also her ability to endure something that wasn't taught in training. A challenge that involved not only endurance, but also choice. Because in the army, there were codes everyone knew, and others that were only whispered through actions. And she knew she had just received one of those silent signals. When the circuit ended, the soldiers were released for hydration and equipment adjustment. She stepped aside, removed her glove, and rubbed her hands, trying to ward off the cold, or perhaps trying to erase the memory of that contact. But the echo lingered. In the distance, she saw the general talking to two officers, but there was something about the way he momentarily looked away and locked eyes with her that made her heart race again. It wasn't an invitation, but it wasn't a barrier either. And then, a new command. "Everyone, to the main courtyard." The tone was urgent, different from usual. The training was quick, but the sight of a military vehicle arriving at the base caught everyone's attention. The tinted windows made it impossible to see who was inside, but the feeling was that something important had just changed. Beside the vehicle, the general assumed a formal posture, as if about to receive someone who could not be ignored. And as she tried to comprehend what was happening, she felt that somehow she was about to be involved in something beyond the simple routine of a barracks. The tinted window opened like a heavy eyelid, and two men descended first, wearing no uniforms, long coats, and discreet badges dangling from their pockets. The woman followed, her hair tied in a stiff bun, her gaze piercing the snow like someone measuring the temperature of a secret. The murmur ran through the formation before any order was given. CID. The word didn't need to be spoken aloud for every column of air in the base to change density, and she felt her stomach tighten, not out of guilt, but out of survival instinct. When the investigation arrives, even the innocent reorganize memories. The general lifted his chin, saluted with meticulous formality, and for a second that lasted longer than the entire winter, he seemed to notice no one but his team. Only then did his eyes sweep over the platoon, sweeping the ranks, until they landed on her with the calculated naturalness of someone choosing a piece on a board. It was with that utterly neutral gaze that he said, "Soldier, accompany the agents to Hangar 3. It wasn't permission, it was a summons. She obeyed with the discipline she'd trained over years, but her heart was beating out of step, and the old touch, the brief touch on her shoulder, flared again like an ember under the snow. Along the way, the agents walked in professional silence, and the woman with the bun, a lieutenant colonel in intelligence she could tell by her tone, asked bluntly if she'd been present at last week's night exercise. What she'd heard, what she'd noticed was different. She answered clearly, citing times, conditions, the radio failures everyone pretended hadn't occurred, and the lieutenant colonel wrote down every detail without looking up, as if afraid any human contact would unravel the thread of her story. They reached Hangar 3, metallic and cold inside like an empty ribcage, and the team dispersed toward the sealed armory and the security cameras. Meanwhile, she signed a confidentiality agreement that felt more like a pact, and felt on her tongue the taste of iron that comes when truth meets its own shadow. There was nothing to hide, she repeated to herself, but there was much to understand. A black communications box was pulled from a cabinet, as if it were an exhausted heart, and the lieutenant colonel commented that the log showed a sequence of interference moments before a red signal was triggered, something not consistent with training, and the sentence hung in the air, too heavy to fall. It was then that the general entered, his movements restrained, his voice lower than usual, and for a moment the entire hangar seemed to shrink, as if his presence required less air to keep out the noise. He asked for the preliminary report, received a few lines, didn't change his expression, and upon returning them he spoke to the team with the authority of someone holding a bridge in their hands. Total collaboration, maximum urgency, no leaked assumptions. And only then, like someone adjusting a picture on the wall to ensure the level is perfect, did he address her with impeccable formality, calling her by her rank and last name, asking her to recount, now in his presence, every detail of what she saw, heard, and felt. The word felt rang out against the metal of the hangar with an echo no one registered, but she did. The touch on her shoulder returned with the force of a memory emerging from beneath the ice, and yet she kept her voice steady, describing the biting wind, the untimely whistle, the sound of a distant engine not listed on the scale, the intermittent light to the north, as if the sky were blinking to warn that some things were not following protocol. At the end of her statement, the general nodded once. The agents gathered up their notes and the lieutenant colonel dismissed her with a "Thank you, soldier." That wasn't just gratitude. It was a signal, confirmation that there was something there that went beyond a technical glitch. As she stepped through the door back into the cold, she understood that she had been pulled into the center of a silent whirlwind, and that the first choice had already been made without ceremony. He had placed her in a position where it would be impossible to pretend nothing had happened. In the courtyard her boots struck again, but the world's rhythm was askew. The touch that might have been merely a correction now carried a dangerous context, and the presence of the investigation lent the gesture a gravity neither of them could shake without cost. As she walked, she noticed the interrupted conversations, the averted eyes, her colleagues who seemed to be gauging whether she was part of the problem or the solution. In the army, reputations change like the direction of the wind. She took a deep breath, the air burning inside, and promised herself she wouldn't be pushed into a role she hadn't chosen. But she also knew that fate likes to disguise itself as an order received. In the distance, the general watched the routine resume its pattern, like someone ensuring the ice remains intact above the choppy water. Deep inside, she knew that what he had called training no longer fit into any comfortable word, and that the next time he laid a finger on her, there would be no way to say he was merely adjusting his posture. The next day dawned with an unusual silence at the base, the kind of silence born not of peace, but of waiting. The sky was grey and the snow, still fresh, reflected a pale light that made every movement seem slower. She woke before the wake-up call, as if something in her body knew this would be no ordinary day. He dressed unhurriedly, but with automatic precision, his uniform fitting his body like a second skin, mask and armor all at once. As he stepped out into the courtyard, he noticed the ranks were tenser, the pace more measured, and glances met too quickly, as if unwilling to be caught watching. The general stood there in the center, with the same impeccable posture as always, but there was a different weight to his expression, almost imperceptible to those unfamiliar with the language of micro-expressions. He began to speak, his voice carrying authority and a note of gravity that no one dared question. He said the investigation was still ongoing and that everyone's cooperation was mandatory. He spoke of discipline, of loyalty, but each word seemed to carry a second layer of meaning, as if it weren't just for the group, as if it were for her. At the end, he glanced quickly in her direction before ordering the day's training to proceed as normal. It was a subtle gesture, but enough to make the butterflies in her stomach return. During the exercises, the atmosphere was strange. The commands were more curt, the movements more mechanical, as if everyone just wanted to get through the day. In the middle of a sequence of tactical simulations, he approached again. The touch this time was even quicker, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. His thumb pressed lightly against the fabric of her jacket, as if transmitting a coded message, and the next moment he had turned to correct another soldier. To anyone else, it would have meant nothing. To her it was like receiving a secret note in the middle of a crowd. Hours later, while searching equipment in the warehouse, she heard footsteps approaching. It wasn't the hurried pace of soldiers on duty. It was slower, more controlled. Turning, she saw the general standing in the doorway, expressionless to betray the reason for his visit. He entered, closed the door behind him, and said quietly that he needed to speak to her away from prying ears. He explained that there was something in the night training that shouldn't have happened, and that certain people wanted to ensure no one connected the dots. "You saw more than you realize," he said, and it sounded more like a warning than a compliment. She tried to keep her voice steady as she asked what exactly he wanted her to do. His answer was straightforward: nothing. Don't talk, don't question, just follow orders as always. But the way he said it, the way his eyes held hers, conveyed a tension that wasn't on the surface. It sounded more like a plea for mutual protection than a hierarchical order. Before leaving, he stepped forward, close enough for her to feel the warmth of his body despite the biting cold outside. He said in a barely audible tone, "Not everything here is about war. Sometimes it's about who survives to tell the tale." Then he left, leaving her alone in the warehouse, the sound of the door closing echoing like a seal on a dangerous secret. She knew that from that moment on, she was trapped in something that could either save her or destroy her. And worst of all, she wasn't sure she wanted to break free. Night fell over the base like a thick blanket, muffling sounds and hiding expressions that in daylight would have been easily read. The wind picked up, blowing like a constant whisper, and the lights in the yard formed yellow circles in the snow, reminiscent of watchful, unblinking eyes. She couldn't sleep. His touch, the conversation in the depot, and the calculated silence between orders that day repeated themselves like a film that never quite ended. In the distance, she heard the deep rumble of an engine, and through the narrow window saw a small convoy passing through the main entrance. There were no timetables for movements like that, and in the army every unusual event is a sign of something bigger moving behind the scenes. Minutes later the muster bell rang out, but only for a select few. Her name was on the list. She put on her coat, adjusted her boots and followed the icy corridor to Hangar 2. There the general stood rigidly, with the posture of someone carrying an invisible weight and unable to let anyone notice. Beside him, the same intelligence lieutenant colonel, now coatless in a clean uniform, her eyes fixed on her. There were no greetings, just a command to enter and close the door. On the metal table lay an open map and several blurry photographs of lights on the horizon. The lieutenant colonel asked her what she remembered from the night of the special training, and this time the word training was uttered with subtle irony. She repeated what she had said before, but when she described the moment of the untimely whistle and the distant engine, the general tilted his head slightly, as if confirming something he already suspected. Then the lieutenant colonel blurted out, "Those lights weren't ours." The silence that followed was cut by the sound of wind buffeting the structure. The general stepped forward, and in a low voice said that some operations at the base were classified beyond the comprehension of any ordinary soldier. Sometimes the danger comes not from those on the other side of the battle line, but from those behind you. She felt the chill seep through her clothes, not from the weather, but from the knowledge that she was at the center of something involving fractured loyalties. The map was folded, the photos collected, and the general dismissed her with a simple, "Rest, soldier." But as she left, she noticed his gaze lingered a second too long on hers, and there was a weight there that couldn't be lifted with orders. As he crossed the empty yard, he noticed fresh boot prints in the snow going back and forth to a spot that wasn't on any standard route. He followed it with his eyes and saw a faint glow at the edge of the field, as if something had been left there on purpose. The urge to follow and find out what it was warred with the knowledge that every step out of line could cost not only his career, but his very life. In her room, she sat on the bed and took off her boots. The soles bore chunks of caked snow, and in the silence, she realized that, even without answers, she was getting closer to something she could no longer ignore. Deep down, I knew the general's touch wasn't just a gesture, it was a marker, a point in time when everything began to change. And now, each event seemed to guide her to a place from which there might be no return. Morning arrived with a leaden, overcast sky, as if the weather itself knew something was about to break. The réveillé sounded earlier than usual, and the cold seemed denser, clinging to her skin like a second uniform. She got up without question, but the rush in the corridors betrayed that this was no ordinary day. In the courtyard, the formation was thinner. Some soldiers were absent, and no one seemed willing to comment. The general loomed like a tall, firm shadow, his eyes sweeping the group with the precision of someone counting every piece before battle. As he announced the start of an unscheduled exercise, the tension rose. In the army, surprises are rarely innocent. The soldiers were divided into pairs for a mock patrol around the base. She was assigned to the eastern route, along with a sergeant who barely spoke and seemed more interested in keeping pace than exchanging a word. The wind was harsh, and snow began covering the tracks almost as soon as they were made, as if the place were trying to erase the tracks before anyone could follow them. Halfway there, the sergeant's radio crackled with interference, and a clipped voice gave a code she didn't recognize. The sergeant simply nodded, changed direction without explanation, and quickened his pace, as if he knew exactly where to go. After a few minutes, they reached a small abandoned structure that had previously served as an observation post. Inside, the air was heavy, smelling of metal and oil. On a rusty table sat a black box identical to the one he had seen in the hangar days before. The sergeant began fiddling with the latches, but before he could open it, a sound behind them made them turn. The general was there, standing in the doorway, his gaze hard and unquestioning. Without a word, he gestured for the sergeant to leave, and when they were alone, he closed the door. He approached the box, ran his hand over its cool surface, and said softly, "You can still get out of this. But you have to decide now." The words carried no threat, but an almost paternal weight, as if it were a last chance before a point of no return. She asked what exactly was at stake, and he simply replied, "More than your career. More than mine." The silence between them was so thick that the sound of the wind outside seemed distant. The general leaned in slightly, looking at her directly, and added, "There are things that only survive because no one dares speak of them. And there are people who don't survive precisely because they break that pact." He then placed his hand on her shoulder again, firm but not aggressive, a touch that carried both a warning and a silent bond. When they left the structure, the sergeant was no longer around. The walk back to base was made without words, but each step felt like a countdown. Something was about to happen, and the feeling was that the next move could not be undone. The break didn't come with explosions, screams, or shouted orders. It came with the subtle sound of a gunshot, muffled by the snow, so distant it might have gone unnoticed by anyone who hadn't learned to distinguish the echo of wind from the sound of a bullet. She and the general were still a few meters from the base gates when the radio attached to his belt crackled with a short, urgent code. He didn't respond immediately, just fixed her with that look that seemed to weigh possibilities in seconds. "Keep moving, soldier. Don't look back." His voice was controlled, but there was something else in it. Confirmation that what was about to happen wasn't training. He followed as ordered, but every muscle screamed for him to turn his head. As they passed through the gates, he noticed the movement on the base had changed. 2 armored vehicles ready to leave, soldiers running toward the weapons depots, and in the background, a small group gathered near Hangar 3, where the lights remained on even in the grey morning. The general walked away from her without explanation, plunging into the controlled confusion, and disappeared behind a row of trucks. That's when she saw it. Near the observation tower on the white ground, a jagged streak of red, small but too vivid to be melted snow. She followed her instinct and approached, feeling her heart race. It didn't take long to find the source, a young soldier, leaning against the wall, breathing too fast with a clean wound on his shoulder. His eyes widened at the sight of her, and before she could ask anything, he grabbed her arm tightly and whispered, "It's not what you think." Don't trust anyone who's telling you not to think." The sentence burned like a seal on her skin. Before she could respond, 2 men in long coats, not soldiers, swooped in, pulled her aside, and began dragging the wounded man away. One of them gave her a cold look, as if gauging how much silence she would need. She backed away, but the feeling of being trapped in something greater than she had imagined intensified. Later, as she prepared for the afternoon shift, she received an unexpected summons to report to the general's office. The corridor leading there seemed narrower, and each step echoed like a prelude. Upon entering, he was alone, leaning against his desk, his usual stiffness gone. There was a trace of tiredness in his eyes, but also something she couldn't quite decipher. "Did you see something you shouldn't have?" he asked bluntly. She hesitated, choosing her words as if walking on thin ice. He moved closer, closing the space between them until she could feel the heat of his breath. "Sometimes protecting someone means letting them believe a lie, but I need to know if you're willing to carry this." The touch came again, on the shoulder, firm, but this time lingering enough that there was no doubt it wasn't just a posture adjustment. Because if you keep going, there's no going back. Outside, a metallic sound echoed, as if something heavy had fallen. She glanced at the door, and in that instant she realized whatever was going to happen next had already begun. The metallic sound repeated, louder, followed by a rarely heard alarm, a low, drawn-out tone used only for internal emergencies that couldn't be announced publicly. The general straightened, and in one swift movement, he opened the bottom drawer of his desk, removing a black folder that he tucked under his arm. "Come with me," he ordered, already walking toward the door. She followed him, feeling the chill permeate the hallway. But it wasn't just the morning air. It was the awareness that each step took them further from safety. As they emerged into the courtyard, the chaos was contained but visible. Soldiers were being directed to strategic points, 2 armored vehicles were speeding away, and at the northern end of the base, dark smoke was beginning to rise. There was no explanation. The general advanced to Hangar 3, where the intelligence lieutenant colonel was already waiting for them, speaking with 2 men in suits who clearly weren't army personnel. The atmosphere was one of calculated urgency, the kind of movement where every gesture has been decided hours before, but is executed as if improvised. As they approached, the lieutenant colonel handed the general a small device, the size of a portable radio. "It was found within the perimeter less than 500 meters from here. The signal matches last week's interference." He looked at the object and then back at her, and in the silence of his gaze, there was more than concern. There was confirmation that she was somehow connected to it. The general didn't explain anything. He simply led her into the hangar and closed the doors. The smell of fuel and metal was strong, and in the center, on a table covered with a military cloth, sat another object, this time an open box filled with cables and electronic components. He removed the cloth and said, "This isn't training. This is an invasion." She tried to make sense of the connection, but before she could speak, he continued, "The problem is, someone inside this base facilitated the entry of this equipment, and the chances of them believing it was you are greater than you think." The words hit like an invisible blow. For a moment, she felt the ground disappear. It made no sense until she realized the true weight of the situation. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was what would be recorded in the reports. Outside, the commotion seemed to increase. Someone knocked on the hangar door and announced that 2 more devices had been found. The general took a deep breath, ran his hand over his face, and said softly, almost personally, "If I protect you, I'll pay a price. But if I don't, they'll crush you." The dilemma hung in the air, like snow suspended before falling. She understood that any decision from that moment on would have an irreversible cost, and that the touch on her shoulder, so simple weeks ago, was now a mark of belonging to a secret that could ruin them both. Outside, a loud bang echoed, and the entire base seemed to stop for a second. Karma was starting to take its toll, and no one was ready for the coming bill. The bang reverberated in the frigid air like a final warning, and soon came 2 more, sharp, rhythmic bangs, coming from the direction of the East Tower. The general opened the hangar door and stepped out, looking up, as if expecting that sound to arrive sooner or later. She followed, instinctively maintaining the same precise distance she had learned to maintain during patrols, but inside she felt that now every step would take her deeper into a labyrinth with no exit. In the courtyard, 2 soldiers ran carrying a body covered in a makeshift blanket. The weight and haste didn't seem like a rescue, it seemed like containment. The general intercepted the group, lifted the blanket and looked. The pale face that emerged belonged to one of the surveillance operators, a man known for keeping his head down and never engaging in conversation. Dead. The wound, clean and precise, betrayed execution, not combat. He covered his body again and gave quick orders: reinforce perimeters, close access, review cameras. But before returning to the hangar, he gave her a quick look, a look that didn't ask for trust, it warned. Suddenly, a metallic voice echoed over the base's loudspeakers, something that rarely happened. "Private," her last name, "report immediately to the command room." Everyone's eyes turned. The order was unusual, and the fact that it was public left her exposed in a way that seemed calculated. The general frowned but said nothing. He simply gestured discreetly for her to come. The control room was too bright, too cold, and in the center sat a table with 3 officers she didn't know. One of them read aloud from a report, claiming to have footage of her circulating in the restricted area the night before. She tried to explain that she was in the barracks, but one of the officers turned the monitor to show the video. The image was blurry, but the figure, height and movement were too similar to convince anyone who wanted to believe it. "Until we confirm, you're under observation," the older man said, his tone sounding more like a sentence than a precaution. As he stepped outside, the cold seemed even more biting. Outside, the general waited, leaning against a jeep, his coat buttoned up to the last button. He didn't ask what had happened. He simply said, "They already knew where to attack. This is to get to me, and they're using you." She wanted to believe, but doubt had already set in. If he was innocent, why was he always there before things happened? And if not, why was he protecting her? Karma, silently, seemed to have chosen the perfect moment to reverse the tide. Now it was no longer she who needed him. It was he who, somehow, needed her to believe. As they walked together back to the barracks, the snow began to fall thicker, covering footprints and tracks. Everything at the base could be erased, except the feeling that the truth was there, buried, and that when it came out, it would spare no one. The next summons came not over a loudspeaker, but in a folded note slipped under the dorm door. No name, just a time and place. 11:15 p.m., observation tower deactivated. The handwriting was firm, masculine, and though there was no signature, she knew exactly who it was from. The night chill was relentless as she left the room, the snow crunching beneath her boots and the wind cutting her face like tiny blades. The path to the tower was a corridor of shadows, lit only by the flickering light of a distant streetlight. The general was there, leaning against the structure without his official coat, just a civilian overcoat that clashed with the military surroundings. "We don't have much time," he said, handing her a tiny flash drive barely visible in his palm. "Here's the raw footage from last night's cameras. The video they showed you was edited. If this gets out, we'll not only prove your innocence, but we'll also expose who's behind it." She held the object as if it were a loaded weapon. She knew that in the wrong hands it could disappear in seconds. "Why give me this?" she asked, feeling the weight of the answer matter more than the device itself. The general took a deep breath before replying, "Because now it's you who decides who falls and who remains standing." In that instant, she realized the dynamic had completely reversed. Until then, he had been the one leading the way, protecting her, deciding what she should and shouldn't know. Now his survival, and perhaps that of the base itself, was in her hands. But along with this power came the bitter realization that by using it, she would have to choose between remaining silent and being complicit, or breaking away and facing the irreversible consequences. A metallic clang echoed in the distance, coming from the northern area. The general glanced quickly in that direction, his expression tense. "If you decide to act, do it quickly. They already know I've been looking for you." And without waiting for a response, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving her alone with the wind and that small fragment of truth burning in her hand. Back at his quarters, he hid the flash drive under the lining of his boot, where no one would easily search. But sleep wouldn't come. The options whirled through his mind like sharp blades. Hand it over and save his own skin, keep the secret and sync with the general, or pit the two sides against each other until the truth was fully revealed. For the first time since it all began, she had control. But she also knew that control is the first thing fate likes to take away when it realizes you think you have it. The day dawned with a strange weight in the air, as if the base were caught between two silences. The silence before the storm and the silence after something irretrievable. The réveillé bell rang, but activity wasn't at its usual pace. Soldiers moved in smaller groups, officers exchanged quick glances, and the presence of men in suits circulating between the facilities indicated the investigation had advanced to a stage few witnessed without paying a price. In the cafeteria, she felt the eyes on her. They weren't direct glances, but the way the conversations faded as she passed made it clear that her name had already been woven into a plot she might never be able to undo. She sat alone, feigning disinterest, but her ears were alert. Words like evidence, flash drive, and cameras emerged in whispers, as if the base itself had developed a habit of speaking in codes. Shortly thereafter, she was summoned to the Intelligence Lieutenant Colonel's office. The tone of the summons was direct, almost bureaucratic, but in the military world, even cold formality can be a weapon. Upon entering, she found the officer behind a squeaky clean desk, a single envelope in the center. "We believe you have information you haven't shared," she said, without preamble. "And I don't mean what you saw, but what you have." Her heart raced. She didn't respond immediately. The lieutenant colonel continued, "You can hand it over now and get it sorted, or wait for us to conduct a formal search. But remember, once we find it, there will be no more room for negotiation." It was a dangerous game, and she knew any hasty reaction could be interpreted as a confession. She kept her voice steady. "I have nothing beyond what I've already told you." The officer studied her for a few long seconds, as if measuring invisible fissures, and then simply said, "You can go." Back at the barracks, the pressure seemed to increase by the second. The flash drive was still hidden under the lining of his boot, intact, but it felt like it was pulsing, as if something so explosive could not be hidden for long. He considered destroying it. He considered copying it. He considered handing it to someone outside the base, but any move would require a risky step. Late that afternoon, he received a coded message on the radio. 3 short beeps and 1 long beep. It was the signal the general had mentioned days earlier, a code meaning now or never. That night, as the base slept under a heavy blanket of snow, she knew she had to choose. Either she would unleash the truth and watch everything fall apart, or she would erase the only piece of evidence that could save them and become forever complicit. The base seemed suspended in time that night. The wind blew steadily, but there were no other sounds. No hurried footsteps, no slamming doors, no muffled conversations. Only that thick silence that precedes choices that cannot be undone. She sat on the edge of the bed for minutes that felt like hours, staring at her boots on the floor as if they were a portal. The flash drive was there, wedged beneath the lining, too small to carry so much weight and yet large enough to decide destinies. He took a deep breath, pulled on his boots, and left the barracks. The cold bit his face, but it wasn't enough to slow his steps. He followed the outer corridor to the decommissioned communications tower, the only place on the base where he knew there wasn't active listening. The door creaked as it opened, and the air inside was still saturated with rust and dust. In the corner, an old desk still held an ancient computer used years ago for internal transmissions. He inserted the flash drive into the USB port. The screen took a while to light up, and when it did, it displayed folders labeled only with dates and codes. He opened the most recent one. The raw video began to play. The night of the supposed training, seen from an angle that hadn't been shown in the command room. The images were clear. She wasn't in the restricted area. In her place was someone wearing a similar uniform, but with a patch on the shoulder, a patch only senior officers wore. And the face, caught for a moment in the dim light, was unmistakable. The general. Shock made the air evaporate for a moment. Every piece, every line, every touch, every gesture took on a new meaning. He wasn't just protecting her. He was protecting himself. Transferring the evidence into her hands wasn't an act of trust, but of delegating risk. If the flash drive were discovered with her, it would be his name that would sink first. The dilemma took on another layer. She could take the video directly to the lieutenant colonel and clear her name, but that would mean destroying the man who had somehow also kept her alive. She could delete it and preserve them both, but she would remain trapped in his shadow forever. Or she could keep the evidence and wait for the right moment to turn the tables on everyone. A noise behind her interrupted her train of thought. Footsteps. Slowly, she turned. The general stood in the doorway, his face half in shadow, half illuminated by the pale reflection of the snow. He said nothing. He simply glanced at the screen, then back at her, and took a single step forward. "Now you know," he murmured, as if the weight of the sentence were enough to fill the entire room. She closed the video, removed the flash drive, and hid it in her inside coat pocket. She didn't respond. She walked past him, feeling his gaze burning her back until she reached the exit. In that moment, the decision had already been made, but not revealed, and silently she began to realize that karma doesn't choose sides. It just waits. The next morning brought a pale sun, the kind that illuminates but doesn't warm, as if the light were simply fulfilling its duty, unconcerned with what it reveals. The base seemed calmer, almost normal, but she had already learned to distrust that appearance. Everything was in place. Vehicles lined up, soldiers in training, officers reviewing reports, and yet at the same time everything was out of place, like a chess piece that appears untouched but has already been moved in the early hours. The order came mid-breakfast. Everyone was to gather in the central courtyard for an official announcement. When she arrived, the high-ranking officers were lined up, with the intelligence lieutenant colonel in the center. Her voice was firm without pause, as she announced that the investigation had identified the source of the interference and found the person responsible. A murmur ran through the ranks of soldiers when the name was announced, the general. He stood there, hands visible, staring blankly at the horizon, unresponsive. Two armed officers approached and escorted him out. Protocol followed with almost ritualistic precision. No one dared intervene. She kept her face impassive, but inside she felt the weight of the flash drive in her inside coat pocket. She hadn't handed it over. She hadn't shown it to anyone. It hadn't been her evidence that had condemned him, and perhaps precisely for that reason, it was more cruel. Fate had found another way to expose the truth, as if karma, patiently, had waited for the right moment to act, without needing her hand. As the general passed her, he looked away for just a second, and in that brief instant there was something that not even the fall could erase, a silent recognition, not of loyalty, but of complicity in the game they had both played and lost. Later, alone in the dorm, she removed the flash drive and placed it on the table. It was small, harmless, almost banal, but it carried a weight no one else knew existed. She could destroy it and rid herself of her last connection to it. She could keep it as a reminder of what she had experienced. She could even use it one day, if the past came back to collect with interest. Instead, he opened the drawer, placed the flash drive in the back, and closed it. Not out of fear nor attachment, but because he understood that some truths belong to no one. They belong to time, and time, like the ice that covers the foundation, always breaks one day. Outside, the snow fell silently, and she knew with a piercing clarity that in the army, as in life, the lightest touch can leave the deepest mark. The next morning brought a pale sun, the kind that illuminates but doesn't warm, as if the light were simply fulfilling its duty, unconcerned with what it reveals. The base seemed calmer, almost normal, but she had already learned to distrust that appearance. Everything was in place. Vehicles lined up, soldiers in training, officers reviewing reports. And yet, at the same time, everything was out of place, like a chess piece that appears untouched, but has already been moved in the early hours. The order came mid-breakfast. Everyone was to gather in the central courtyard for an official announcement. When she arrived, the high-ranking officers were lined up, with the intelligence lieutenant colonel in the center. Her voice was firm without pause, as she announced that the investigation had identified the source of the interference and found the person responsible. A murmur ran through the ranks of soldiers when the name was announced. The general. He stood there, hands visible, staring blankly at the horizon, unresponsive. Two armed officers approached and escorted him out. Protocol followed with almost ritualistic precision. No one dared intervene. She kept her face impassive, but inside she felt the weight of the flash drive in her inside coat pocket. She hadn't handed it over. She hadn't shown it to anyone. It hadn't been her evidence that had condemned him, and perhaps precisely for that reason, it was more cruel. Fate had found another way to expose the truth, as if karma, patiently, had waited for the right moment to act, without needing her hand. As the general passed her, he looked away for just a second, and in that brief instant there was something that not even the fall could erase. A silent recognition, not of loyalty, but of complicity in the game they had both played and lost. Later, alone in the dorm, she removed the flash drive and placed it on the table. It was small, harmless, almost banal, but it carried a weight no one else knew existed. She could destroy it and rid herself of her last connection to it. She could keep it as a reminder of what she had experienced. She could even use it one day, if the past came back to collect with interest. Instead, he opened the drawer, placed the flash drive in the back, and closed it. Not out of fear nor attachment, but because he understood that some truths belong to no one. They belong to time. And time, like the ice that covers the foundation, always breaks one day. Outside, the snow fell silently, and she knew with a piercing clarity that in the army, as in life, the lightest touch can leave the deepest mark.